Well, good evening and welcome to another of our SOLAS webinars where we take some contemporary topics, some engaging and tough questions, and we explore them through the lens of the Christian faith. My name is Andy Bannister, Director at the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, and I'm delighted that we have a very special guest for you on the webinar this evening. I'm joined tonight on tonight's webinar by Dr. Rob Waller, and Rob wears a whole number of hats, but he is a consultant psychiatrist, works for the NHS, has done for many years, and is also the director, one of the directors at an organisation called the Mind and Soul Foundation. He's a speaker, he's a psychiatrist, author of many books, which we'll talk about this evening. But Rob this evening is going to help us think through the whole question, or many questions, in fact, around faith and Christianity, the Bible, and mental health. Perhaps a question so pertinent in the times that we live in. So Rob, welcome to this SOLAS webinar.
Thank you, Andy. It's great to be here. It's a bit rainy and disgusting outside, but hopefully we can have some invigorating conversation.
Now, Rob, where are you coming to us from in the UK this evening?
Yeah, well, I'm at home in Edinburgh. I work in Edinburgh. Clinically, I work in the Leith area, and then I also work part of the week at the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, which is in Morningside, where I've got a role to do with digital development.
Fantastic. So actually only about that's only about an hour south of me, because I'm here in Dundee. So there we are, very Scottish flavour this evening, and it is likewise similar to you, a bit of a dark and stormy night out there. Well, really looking forward to digging into some of tonight's theme around mental health. And for folks who've watched these webinars before, we're going to take a similar kind of sort of approach that we've done with previous guests. So I've got some questions for Rob to kind of get the conversation going. And but the main part of the evening, the fun part of the webinar, is the last half an hour where you folks watching at home or on the road, or wherever you're watching from this evening, get to take part and ask a question. And for that we use the Pigeonhole service, and there's the URL at the bottom of your screen. If you go to pigeonhole.at /SOLAS 18 November, or you can just go to pigeonhole.at and type in SOLAS 18 November, and that will take you into the Q&A for tonight's event. And you can do one or two things in there. If, as Rob is talking in a moment, you have questions occur to you, things that you'd like to ask him, you can create a question, and you can do that either with your name, or if you prefer to be anonymous, that's fine too. Especially around some of the themes of tonight, people may prefer to be anonymous. That's fine. But if you want to put your name, that's great. We know who we're addressing. But if you don't have a question, you can still take part in the Q&A tonight, because the magic of Pigeonhole is you can vote for other people's questions. So perhaps in 10-15 minutes time, go have a look on Pigeonhole, see what other people are asking, and if there's a question that you particularly would love to see Rob address, just vote it up to the top of the list, vote for it, and then when it comes to Q&A in about half an hour's time, we'll start working through those popular questions. Well, Rob, we've got a lot to get through this evening, so I'd love to get into some of the questions I'd like to ask you. And I said in the introduction that, with all that's going on with COVID right now, I've heard it said that mental health issues are more prevalent. People are locked down. There's the pressures on jobs and family and so on and so forth. Is that true? Are we facing a bit of a sort of mental health crisis as well as a COVID crisis? What are you seeing? What are some of the trends?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. The long answer is it's a bit more complicated than that, and it depends who you are. So, for example, there's certain mental health conditions like schizophrenia, for example, dementia. Those things have got a fairly steady prevalence. Dementia is increasing because people are living longer, but they are more biological, more genetic. So actually their incidence hasn't changed. What we have seen with those people perhaps is they've not been able to access their normal support services. If they had medication delivered to them, or if they had a support worker or a carer going in, those people haven't been as able to access medication. And perhaps that was okay in the first bit of lockdown because they were able to get by or draw on some favors or manage. But I think what we're seeing now is that those things are beginning to bite. And actually related to that, I've a few of the patients I've seen have had autistic spectrum disorders, and some of them actually quite liked lockdown because the streets were quiet, it was easier to go out. But now that sort of loneliness thing is beginning to kick in, and I think generally we're seeing that it's not good. What we've seen a lot more of definitely is what you might call the more neurotic end of things. So depression, anxiety. If you add into that people perhaps suppressed some of these queries and wonderings at the beginning, they didn't want to go and bother their GPs because they knew they couldn't get into the surgery. They didn't want to bother anybody with a referral. So we saw a real sort of dip in the outpatient clinic, but that is now very much picking up again. And you add on to that a number of other things. So for example, additional stresses. If you're in a industry like catering, for example, and hospitality, where there's particular stresses at the moment and people being made redundant. And also what we're seeing in the talking treatments in the sort of psychology and psychological therapies parts of the service is that people who used to come and see a therapist face to face are perhaps having to get by with phone consulting. And some people can do video consulting, and there's been a big push in the NHS in Scotland. I think we're up to now something like 17,000 video calls per week in Scotland to the NHS. And a lot of those are in the area of CAMS, child and adolescent mental health, and psychological therapies. So we're seeing those numbers go up. But what we also know is that some people, because of digital lack of access, can't access video. So they're having to make do with phone support, which we know is not as good as video and not as good as seeing people face to face. It's better than nothing. But in terms of therapy being put on hold, we've seen a fair bit of that as well.
Now, obviously, I think one of the things I find fascinating about your background, Rob, and others, well, obviously, you've got all the mental health background, all of the experience, all of the training that you bring into your work as a psychiatrist and so forth. But you're also a committed Christian. How do those two things fit together? How does one influence the other? Does Christianity have anything to say into questions around mental health?
Yeah, I mean, that was really how I got into this area. I was finishing off my psychiatry training down in Yorkshire, where I was living at the time, and I was just short of becoming a consultant, and I was doing that Monday to Friday. And then at the weekend, I was involved in one of the elders in a Baptist congregation, a church plant, and, you know, two very, very exciting things, but they never seemed to talk to each other. So it was 15 or so years ago. It was the noughties, so I started writing a blog about it, and amazingly people started reading the blog and commenting on some of these things and actually beginning to see some of these things join together. And they do very much join together. They can also be separate. You know, having a personal faith is no suit of armor against mental health difficulties. And likewise, you know, we know an awful lot about the brain. Psychiatrists, psychologists have been studying the brain intensely for 100 or so years, and also going back before that. So at one level, they can be pursued separately. If I try and give an illustration as to how they might all fit together, if we think of the stories at the beginning of the Bible there in Genesis, it tells this story of perfect relationship with God and then a fall into the state that we're in today, if that makes sense. And it wasn't just a spiritual fall. It wasn't just that the relationship between man and God was broken at that time. It was also a fall in our relationships. We became ashamed of what we were wearing or not wearing, as in that case. We also lost our relationship with ourselves, and we became guilty and blamed other people and pointed fingers. At the same time, we broke the relationship with the environment, and we began to cause damage to the environment and not do what we're meant to be doing to looking after it. So the fall, if you want to take that as a concept, was a breakage in many, many, many different things, in how we look after the environment, in spiritually how we relate vertically, if that's the right word, with God, but also how our minds work and relate. So I think that's one way perhaps to say all of these things are things that have fallen apart to some degree.
Is there it's interesting that you use the phrase suit of armor at one point. So, Christianity doesn't necessarily offer as a suit of armor. Does it offer anything though in terms of resilience. I know there've been sort of studies showing that having Christian faith, or indeed any faith, actually can certainly help you when things like sort of bereavement or loss or so forth come along. But are there any sort of resiliences that having a faith can bring to some of the sort of mental health challenges?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just to pick up specifically about that word resilience, for example, if you talk to any psychologist or researcher worth their salt talking about resilience, they mean something very, very specific about it. I think we've sort of dumbed down that word a little bit, and every single school project I get home seems to be about building resilience and all this sort of thing. And I think it's good that we've got resilience in the curriculum, but resilience means a very, very specific thing in the research. It's the ability to bounce back after a pretty severe trauma, such as a famine or an earthquake or a prolonged psychological trauma. And what a lot of the research shows is that there's a number of factors that help somebody be resilient. One of those is if you are living perhaps in a more affluent country, for example, as opposed to a country that's hit by a hurricane. But one of the big things in that is if you've got a personal faith. So we know that actually having a personal faith is one of the things that makes people most resilient of all. If you sort of get away from resilience a bit and perhaps broaden it out, there's a big body of research around the generally positive effect of personal faith. A lot of that research is big, well controlled, well conducted studies. A lot of them are done in the Bible Belt of America, if that makes sense. So some people have said, that's not a representative part of the world, but there's been lots without that. Harold Koenig, that's Coenig, he's the guy who's put a lot of this research together. And you're right, it shows that on average, people with a faith will do better with their mental health, in the same way that take another social factor, for example, marriage is better than people who are single, which is better than people who are divorced, and so on. There are some of these epidemiological things that have been well thrashed out over time. What's also true is that there's certain sections of society where association with a faith or perhaps an organized religion is damaging. We can all think of times where perhaps there's been a cult or some kind of heavy shepherding or something quite traumatic happening within the church. We think of certain stories in some of the bigger denominations as well that have been pretty horrific. So it can cut both ways. And again, I would like to say that's not due to the faith; it's more due to the institution there.
What I find fascinating is a very slight tangent, but not too much one. Hopefully, is that around the time the kind of so-called new atheism was kicking off about 15 years ago, there was a tendency by some of those writers to pick up the word delusion and kind of weaponize it. So Dawkins famously wrote The God Delusion. I remember talking to one or two friends who came from sort of mental health professionals who got quite perturbed by that, because of course the word delusion has a quite specific meaning, right, in your field, I would imagine. And so I suppose the question I was going to play off what you've just said with about the benefits. What would you have anything to say to one of perhaps our atheist friends who might go, yeah, but religion's a delusion, isn't it? It's a sign that there's something not quite right, up here, if you have a faith.
Yeah, I mean, delusion by definition, I mean, the psychiatric definition of delusion is something which is almost completely non-understandable. And I suppose atheists might say that the Christian faith is non-understandable. But the other criteria are, first of all, that there's absolutely no willingness to engage with evidence to the contrary. And I think that, SOLAS is an example of an organization who is willing to debate. They are willing to discuss. They do want to talk about these things. And I think if there was a criticism of the aggressive new atheists, these four horsemen, is they wouldn't particularly debate. They actually embarrassed many atheists because they were so aggressive and assertive with what they were saying. And then the third thing is that it's out of keeping with cultural norms, and that is not true of faith. We're talking here about established religions. Yes, people are going to sort of trumpet things like as organized religion has now dropped below 49% in the UK and things, or belief in God, but we're still talking millions and millions of people. We're talking about 2 billion people across the world who have a degree of Christian faith. So from a psychiatric point of view, that is not a delusion. Andrew Sims, who's a former president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, wrote a sort of counterpoint book to that called Is Faith a Delusion?, in which he goes into all of these sort of questions in a little bit more detail.
Very glad you mentioned Andrew Sims, because I asked the question, as I asked you the question, Rob, I was like, sure, I've read a book on this, but I can't recall who by. So that's been very helpful, I think, talking about, you know, some of the resources that faith brings. I'm conscious that people watching this, we may have a range of people. We often do on these webinars, folks who are exploring faith, people aren't sure what they believe, but also Christians too, who perhaps are struggling with some of the issues we're talking about tonight. So perhaps a slightly different question I'd like to put to you. What advice might you have for somebody who perhaps is a Christian, who has a religious faith, but is perhaps struggling with mental health issues, but has translated that into assuming that somehow there's something wrong with them? I mean, very personally, I remember in my early 20s going through depression, and you know, it was a year or two of wrestling with that. You know, first trying medication, then talking therapies, eventually made a massive difference. But I can remember one of the big challenges for me was, why as a Christian am I experiencing these things? What would you say to somebody who perhaps is in that position, who's wrestling with things and wondering why they are, and where's God in this?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, what you are describing is the typical functioning of the human brain. So Christians experiencing these things because they have brains. And what that means is that our brains, for example, even day to day, our brains will tend to be risk averse. So, for example, when I cross the road, it is appropriate and sensible for me to look to the left and the right. If I don't, I will be knocked over by a bus. Likewise, at the end of my day, it's appropriate and sensible for me to sit down and think back through my day and think, you know, is there anyone who I offended and perhaps need to apologize for, or was there something I forgot to do? Is there anyone I need to drop a wee email to and just say thank you so much for how they contributed or what they said to me? So it's normal for us to have this sort of neurotic, is the technical word, activity going on in our brains. And neuroticism is a healthy personality trait. It's one of the 5 core personality traits that psychologists will tell you exist. They are all stable. They are found in all traits. They are selected for from a sort of evolutionary perspective. They are all valuable and important. What can happen, however, is that the sort of dial can get turned up on the neuroticism, and that can happen because of life events or stresses. Sometimes there's a genetic contribution to these things, and we can become overly neurotic. And the talking treatment you mentioned there, I'm assuming it was something like CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. What that will do is that will force you to slow down and actually think for the evidence for these things and against these things, and actually sort of stand back and take a slightly different appraisal on it. Because what humans tend to do is they tend to become very self-focused. They tend to sort of make everything refer back to themselves. And again, there's perfectly good explanations and reasons for this. But when you combine that perfect storm of, you know, having a brain that is a neurotic brain, some genetic or social predispositions, some stresses, and, you know, perhaps regressing and not being able to see past the end of your own nose, then it can become quite a sort of dark place in there. So it's at one level, it's an expected functioning of the human brain. At another level, there's things we know will help in that situation.
You know, it's interesting that where you landed that, Rob. I hope it was helpful for some folks listening, because you're absolutely right. I think one of the things I remember back sort of 20-25 years ago that was incredibly helpful actually was just coming to realize that, as you say, it was normal. You weren't alone. You're not the only one going through this. And if somebody watching this tonight is wrestling with some of those things, as Rob said there, that's pretty common. That's not unusual. That doesn't make you an oddity. And there can be help to be found. But Rob, you talked about the stresses that can come to bear and sort of perhaps cause some of those dials, as you put it, to be turned up. And of course, one of the big stresses right now is the one we talked about at the start with COVID and all that's brought. And, you know, as I've spoken a lot on those issues in the last, you know, few months and wrestled them and thought about them, as many of us have, you know, one of the things that has occurred to me and to others is that as a society, it's almost as if we've sort of lost some of the tools for talking about sadness and lament. And when things go wrong, right, we're so used to life being on a level, you know, we're so used to asking someone, how are you? And them simply to go, yeah, I'm fine. And as a society, and perhaps even as a church, we've forgotten how we process some of these harder kind of times. Is there anything, A, from your mental health background, but B, also as a Christian, that you might say that how we might process these things, handle them well, and not let them, have that stressing effect of then causing certain personality traits to go through the roof?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you see this culturally, that everyone's meant to be happy and everyone's meant to have good mental health. Actually, one of the really nice things that I've seen over the last 6 months is perhaps more of an encouragement to be kind to yourself and acknowledge that everyone's going through difficult times, and the vast majority of people are doing what they can. I mean, sure, there's a couple of people who are swinging the lead and trying it on, but most people are actually working really hard. And I think the idea of compassion is something that's found its place back in society, both compassion for other people, more challenging perhaps to be compassionate to yourself. One of the sort of things that I'm less keen on in mental health settings, and it's what's driven a lot of the evidence-based medicine that we have, the research that happened, is this number that somehow summarizes your depression. So if you've got a depression rating scale out of 30, let's say, if you're scoring 20 or above, that might be quite severe depression. And the aim of the treatment is to get that score down into single figures. And of course, I understand that, you do want the symptoms to come down. You do want the person not to be trapped in that sort of dark place. But we don't, the goal of life is not to have a depression rating scale of 0, because actually, for some people, their depression might be chronic. So where does that leave them? Does that leave them a failure? Also, that's not a life goal. Put the faith thing to one side for a moment. Life is not about having a 0 rating scale. It's about understanding who we are. It's about the relationships we have. It's about, almost there's the whole talk, isn't there, about growth through suffering, that we need to suffer to a certain extent. And also, as a Christian, again, the goal here is not to score 0 on a depression rating scale. The goal is to follow Jesus. And as far as I remember, the last few days of his life were pretty darn stressful, and he might have scored quite highly on a few of those rating scales. So the goal here is not to get to 0. And actually, faith's got a really important perspective here. There's a rich tradition within Christianity to engage with and embrace some of these deeper emotions. I won't call them darker, because I think they are just deeper. If you think about the Psalms, for example, there's some happy Psalms and people jumping up and down and dancing and singing songs and all that sort of thing. There's also some depressive Psalms where David and the other writers are really getting themselves down, and why have you forsaken me, oh my God, why so downcast, oh my soul? And then the Psalm 88, which hasn't even got a happy ending. Most of the Psalms manage to sort of turn it around a little bit, but Psalm 88 ends with the phrase, darkness is my only friend. And it's there in the book of Lamentations, as Jeremiah sits there on the ruined city walls and watches the people being taken into exile. So through the Psalter, through the Christian year, with Lent that is not yet Easter, with Advent that is not yet Christmas, we are specifically encouraged to postpone our gratification, to dwell, to do the stations of the cross and follow Jesus down the Via Dolorosa and the sad way. We are specifically encouraged, more locally in Scotland, the rich traditions of Celtic Christianity very much enable us to engage with this. And there's a place for happy clappy and for worship, and I love a good knees up as much as the next person, but there's also a place for meditation, solitude, retreat, pilgrimage, silence, some of these mortifying spiritual disciplines, as Richard Foster and Martin Luther would call them.
Yeah, and gosh, there's a whole conversation we could go down there.
Sorry, that was quite heavy. That
no, it was really good. And what I liked, actually, Rob, as you said that, is to go, one of my favorite books in the Bible is the Psalms, because of that rich range of emotions there. And I confess I didn't wholly come to appreciate what we've got there until I did my own kind of doctoral work, which was in Islamic studies. And when you turn to another scripture like the Quran, there's nothing like the Psalms. You don't have that permission there to bring those emotions to God and be brutally honest. And I think it's remarkably helpful, actually, that to go, if we are struggling, we have there's a psalm for you. If you're rejoicing, there's a psalm for you, and there's something you can bring to, you can really draw into your spirituality there. Well, another area I wanted to touch on, we've got sort of 5 or 6 minutes or so before we're going to throw this open for Q&A and take a look at what our audience are coming up with. But Rob, one of the other areas around mental health that's always fascinated me, just because of friends who have struggled over the years with issues around this, is the whole kind of self-image and identity issue. I think a lot of people have questions around self-worth and their value. We live in a very performance-based society in which people can easily feel if they don't measure up to some scale, somehow their value as human beings isn't quite there. And I was chatting to you before the show began and saying my first job was working for St George's Medical School in London in the psychiatry department of all things. And one of the questions I'd often like to, it was early for me in experimenting with apologetics, but I would occasionally like to sort of ask colleagues who were professionals, I was just administration, I would sometimes sort of teasingly say to counsellors or psychotherapists, what do you say if you've got a patient on your couch who's struggling with self-image, and you start diving into their life a little bit, and you suddenly realize, gosh, I can see why. No one likes them. Their wife has left them. They've got no friends. Their teenagers hate them. They support Crystal Palace FC. Everything looks terrible. And on every conceivable metric, there is nothing. But of course, the Christian faith does add a little something. I just wonder whether there's something that Christianity genuinely can bring around the whole self-image question, because it gives us a basis for value that is not performance-based. Am I onto something there, or am I barking up the wrong tree?
I think so. I mean, just to clarify, of course, I don't have a couch, and I tend not.
I realise that's a terrible stereotype. And
I do have a friend who does have a couch in the corner of his office, but it's extremely rickety, and you do not want to lie down on it. It might fall over. He tends to use it as an extension for his desk and put papers on it. And of course, actually, I don't particularly in my clinical work deal with people perhaps with what you might call more sort of self-esteem or identity sort of issues. I deal mainly with psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar, but some of my colleagues do. And I think that this is a Sigmund Freud quote, which I hope is helpful. Sigmund Freud said, the goal of psychoanalysis is to set people free from neurotic misery and release them into simple unhappiness. And I think what Freud was getting at there is that when people are trapped with mental illness, so what I was talking about, about how when our serotonin is low and we're under all this stress and our adrenaline's up, our brain has this particular way of thinking and we are trapped. Or in my own line of work, people are trapped in psychotic delusions and hallucinations. They are stuck in that place. And what Freud said, he said that, the goal of psychoanalysis is to set us free from those traps, those defense mechanisms, those things we cannot break free from. And psychoanalysis and psychologists have got talking treatment tools to do that. I would perhaps use medication in psychosis to do that. But once someone is free, what is there? And where Freud landed us was, well, simple unhappiness, simple misery. That's what you're left with when you come out the far end. And as a health professional, my goal is to not make people happy. We call it the National Health Service, but actually it's really the National Sickness Service, because we get people from very sick, hopefully, to just unhappy, if that makes sense. And it's other parts of society that give us happiness. And a big part of that is faith. And what you have got in the Bible, obviously, you've got these very strong statements that, you are a loved child of God, that God is for you and not against you, etc., etc., etc. I think what a psychologist or a psychiatrist would add to this is that if you've got a Christian over here who's struggling with their mental health and the Bible over here that's saying these amazing things, they can seem a long way apart. And what you mustn't do is say to people, take 2 Bible verses and call me tomorrow if you're not feeling better, and suddenly expect that the person will close the gap, because it takes a long time to come together. In the Lord's Prayer, it says, forgive other people as you have been forgiven. And it's that sort of drawing together of those two things. It takes a long time. You may know cognitively, intellectually that you have been forgiven, but to be able to forgive someone else maybe miles away from where you are at the moment. And likewise, you may know that God is for you, but you may feel that he is against you. And we would do ourselves a disservice by pushing those things together too quickly. We need perhaps, we're coming back to our Celtic Christianity, aren't we? Perhaps we need to go on a very long pilgrimage, taking several years, to get our emotions in line with the truths that we do believe, but need to bring everything in line with them. And I think psychologists, counselors, psychotherapists, etc., have got lots of tools to help us align these things, to think these things through, and actually to seal it over, put a sticking plaster over it and say, oh yes, of course I believe, you know, I have no problems, I don't doubt as a Christian at all, is actually to deny ourselves. And it doesn't really help anyone in the long term.
That's very helpful, Rob, thank you. Kind of one last question, and then we're going to open things up for Q&A. So we've covered an awful lot in the last 25 minutes. And, you know, some people are probably watching this thinking, okay, this is great, I'd love to go a little bit further. In fact, actually, I noticed the top question on Pigeonhole is actually this one. What would you recommend for reading further? So, yeah, very practically, I mean, you've written books of your own. Maybe there are other things. What would you recommend for somebody who wants to dig deeper in some of the themes that you've talked about tonight? And do feel free to plug your own books, because you've got a slide on those in a minute. Don't be embarrassed.
You know, one of the nice things about doing this talk is that we've got the Mind and Soul Foundation website to back it up, and I think you've got a slide with the URL on it there. So, you know, I don't particularly like doing one-off talks because you tend to result in more questions than answers. So what we've been doing over the last 10-15 years is getting the Mind and Soul Foundation website together. We've got about 1,000 articles. We've got well over 100 videos on our YouTube channel. We've got active social media. We've got a couple of hundred audio seminars, a bit like this one that we've recorded in the past. So there is all sorts of stuff to go and rummage around in there on pretty much anything and everything. I think we've got articles on mental health and farming, mental health and running, all from a sort of Christian and mental health sort of perspective. The other thing is, of course, I have written some books because sometimes it's good to do a deep dive into some of these areas. And there's 3 books you've got on a slide there that people might want to take better: the worry book, the guilt book, and the perfectionism book. And very briefly, the worry book and the guilt book are perhaps for people who are currently struggling with their mental health. Worry perhaps is more about anxiety, particularly chronic anxiety. Guilt is there perhaps about that sort of chronic depression. And of course, the fact that guilt is both a symptom of depression and a normal Christian experience. You know, we ought to feel guilty when we've done something wrong. We shouldn't feel guilty when we've done nothing wrong and it's just the depression talking. And how do we separate those two things out? The perfectionism book is for people who are neurotic but are currently overachieving and are currently sort of burning the candle at both ends to try and fuel self-esteem. And what I would say is read the perfectionism book now, because if you don't, you're going to end up needing to read the worry book or the guilt book in the future.
Brilliant. And those books are available from anywhere in particular, Rob? They can get them?
Yeah, they're published by IVP.
Yep.
The worry book's got an American imprint through Simon & Schuster, and
Right.
They're available Amazon or a good bookshop near you.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a fascinating half an hour, kind of, Rob, and really appreciate you being willing to sort of dive into some of my questions. But I'm excited to get to the questions that our audience have been throwing in. So again, for those of you who missed my or forgot the URL at the start, it's not too late to submit a question. If you go to pigeonhole.at /SOLAS 18 November, or just pigeonhole.at and then type in SOLAS 18 November. And if you're watching this on something like Facebook or whatever, I think that link is in the show notes as well. And then you can just type your question in, or if you don't have a question of your own, you do not need to worry or be a perfectionist. You can just upvote somebody else's question. So you can go to the Pigeonhole site, see what other people are asking, and upvote the question you would like. So, Rob, what I'd like to do then is actually take the first, a couple of the top questions there that have come up on Pigeonhole. And the first one actually is quite a few that are sort of have an equal number of votes. And this ties into perhaps something we were talking about at the start of the interview, where we talked about the new atheism and perhaps the way that they were using sort of delusion language and so forth. Somebody has said, so it's like slight edge to this question. Somebody has asked, with all the complexities and frailties of the human mind, is religion part of the problem or part of the solution? What would you say?
I mean, it can be both, can't it? You know, I think, you know, to have grown up in a very strict religious environment and needing perhaps to break out from that can leave you with a lot of questions. I'm going to say it on air purely because we've got a chapter on it in the guilt book, but well, it's not called this in the guilt book, but we do use this phrase, that no one does guilt like a Catholic. And I don't think it's fair to attribute that just to the Catholic faith. I think there are many religions that can leave people feeling very, very guilty afterwards. And again, I hope I would say that it's not the core aspects of the faith and the religion that do that. It's the particular way that it is put across, the particular image of God that people are given. But there can be a bitter aftertaste. We are frail. We need to be loved and nurtured and encouraged. And if we're not getting that from other sources, and we're getting a faith perspective which doesn't give us that, then it will have consequences. The good news is that's not God. God is not like that. He is not the wicked headmaster. Neither is he the fluffy Santa. He is someone who is much richer and deeper and far more interested in us and this planet than that. So I think what I would say is a good Christian counselor will help you work those things through. Again, they won't sort of expect you to take 2 Bible verses and see them in the morning. They will give you space. They will give you space to be cross with God, to be angry with God, to be annoyed with God. A friend of mine once said, if God created the universe, he can handle you on a bad day. And he can. So we should feel free in the Psalms like that. And is religion part of the solution? Well, I think it can be. The word religion, I'm going to get beyond myself and quote Greek here, but my understanding is it means to bind, to support. It's not the God of the mountaintops that we are slowly replacing with science. It's not, as Karl Marx said, the opium that suppresses the people. It's something which is a core part of human society, always has been, I believe always will be. It's something that we need to help us function. I'd go beyond that and say it's true, but I would say it's a vital part of how we think about this. It's so important that we have conversations about humanity, about identity, about purpose, and science is not going to give us those answers.
Yeah, great answer, Rob. Thank you. Well, we're going to the questions are coming in thick and fast from all kinds of different angles. So now we're going to jump from perhaps that more maybe slightly kind of philosophical one to perhaps a more practical one. Somebody has asked a question here and said, if you're struggling with some kind of problem or some kind of issue, how do you know if your problem is spiritual and you should perhaps go see a pastor, or if it's medical, see a GP, or if it's psychological, you should see a counselor or a therapist? How should you approach that?
Well, I'd probably take it back to what I said at the beginning and say that it is possibly all three. And I'm going to add into that, if it's ecological, you should probably start recycling as well. I think we need to take a sort of multimodality approach to many, many things. And if you meet someone who tries to boil all of life's problems down to just psychological or just scientific or just spiritual or just demonic or something else, my thing I often say is if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you are a psychologist or love psychology, you might sort of say, aha, all of these things can be explained by psychological problems. All you need is enough therapy and it'll come out the far end. I think we need to see these things in the whole. So if someone is struggling with mental illness, they the advice has to be to go and see your GP, to perhaps see a counselor, to have that through. But you also ought to be taking a spiritual approach to it. If you're a person of faith, you should be, because they will affect your faith. If you are feeling low and sad and trapped, it will be coloring your faith to some degree, and be able to talk that through with someone is very important. Likewise, if you've got depression or something like, a more clinical depression where, your serotonin is low, your brain is behaving in the ways that we've been talking about, seeing a priest will be extremely interesting, but the evidence base is actually around CBT and antidepressants. So you may be getting existential questions answered and you might be feeling supported, but actually the levers and the tools that you need to climb that ladder out of that sort of miry pit of depression are with someone else. And I think you can do both. And I'm always very happy when someone walks into my clinic room accompanied by a family member or someone from their church, because it means that I know this person is not walking through this alone.
Yeah. Great, again, really helpful answer, Rob. Well, we're going to go from the philosophical to the kind of practical, now to the theological, because this one's floated up the list at the top of the pigeonhole. Is fascinating. So obviously, as Christians who take the Bible seriously, we believe that there is a realm of evil, there is a demonic realm, and then we read the Gospels, we see Jesus engaged with that. He had a reputation as an exorcist. So how, this person asked, do you spot, a mental health issue as opposed to or compared to a demonic attack? Somebody is experiencing perhaps intrusive thoughts. The medics want to say this is, this condition. How, as a Christian, do we, sort of navigate that and be sure it is just a medical issue, or it might be something else going on as well? And there's obviously all kinds of issues there. If you get that wrong, it can cause all kinds of issues.
Yeah.
How do Christians think that issue through wisely and pastorally?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say on this, and I think there's also a question that was sort of bumbling up with a few votes around. How do you pray healing for somebody? So I'll maybe put that in. The first thing to say is I'm always interested when people say that Jesus was an exorcist in the same breath almost as a conversation around mental health, because actually, if you look at the 10 or 12 exorcisms that happen in the New Testament, first of all, a whole bunch of them are about political situations and people who were nasty pieces of work or were suppressing the Jewish people being attributed to the influence of Satan in some shape or form. A bunch of them were to do with physical illness, and a bunch of them were to do with epilepsy. And I don't very often hear people saying, oh yeah, I had a couple of seizures and I went to go and see a neurologist and I've been put on anti-epileptic tablets, but I'm wondering if I should have an exorcism as well. I've never heard that in my life. But that was how epilepsy, if that makes sense, seemed to be understood in those days. And if you do pin down, perhaps there's one, which would be I think it's Mark 5 or John 5, I forget, but the classic title for this story is the Gerasene demoniac. People always say, aha, that's schizophrenia, but it doesn't look like schizophrenia to me. I'm a psychiatrist. I see people with schizophrenia pretty much every working day, and it does not look like that. If anything, it looks perhaps more like a personality disorder of some kind. And also, once that person had received the deliverance, they were given an extremely important job. They were put in charge of evangelism to the 10 largest towns in the area, the so-called Decapolis, the towns around that. And this person went on to be the second most prolific evangelist in the New Testament, apart from the Apostle Paul in his travels. So what we've got there is, like I say, I do not associate deliverance and mental illness at all. If I'm being honest to the New Testament, it's a feature, but it's not really what it's about. And we need to be very careful when we ask that kind of question. And also, if there is a malign or an evil influence there, we need to be very, very clear that this person actually, if they have been healed or delivered, is now worthy of Christian service, of friendship, of respect, should be given a job, should not be tarred with that stigmatizing, oh, he was once mentally ill brush, because that's not what happened in that story. What I would say, practical tips here. I never talk about exorcism, because exorcism to me sounds like some sort of Hollywood movie and sort of crossed goat's legs and this kind of sort of slightly scary sort of thing. I always talk about deliverance ministry. And like I say, if you believe in a good power, then logically perhaps there is an evil power, so deliverance should be there. But there's ways to do it. So the Anglican and Catholic churches are very, very clear and strict on this. Every diocese will have someone who's approved by the bishop to be the nominated deliverance ministry. They have a liturgy for it. It's not sort of dancing and jumping and all getting excited. It's a liturgy. It is, the power here is in the name of Jesus, not how loud you shout, I guess is what I'm saying. So it's a relatively unexciting liturgy. That minister should be supported by regular meetings with mental health professionals. I used to meet on a termly basis with the chap who had this role for the Catholic diocese in Bradford. And it was very much sort of, yes, I think it could be this, it could be that. We need to see this person together. There was an approach there that was collaborative. And then if there is to be a ministry of deliverance, a particular time where there would be a service of some kind, again here, it should be low key. It should be, first of all, discerning. praying, dear God, is this what is going on here? Or actually, is this person just really struggling and they need love and affection? And then if you do decide to go down a ministry of deliverance liturgy of some kind, it should be, right, well, we've prayed. Jesus is the savior of the world. God is the God of the universe. We have prayed. This whatever it is has gone. Let's pray a closing prayer of blessing. We're not going to sort of wrestle for 10 hours. Most people in this situation have had enough negative experiences before they get to that kind of ceremony. So let's treat people with respect. Let's pray in a way which is faith-filled, but not jumping up and down, because the power is not from our jumping. It's from who we are praying to.
Again, really lots of really helpful practical advice in there, Rob. Thank you. I'm going to take two questions actually now from Pigeonhole around the same kind of theme and just connect them together. There's a couple of questions here around depression that interests me, and both come from the same person who's named herself in the question. So Ezzy, wherever you are, thank you for these. The first question she asks is, she says, Christians talk about experiencing things like joy, peace, and meaning from God. How does that relate to depression when it feels like all those things get stripped away? How can depressed people know spiritual joy? And the second question she asks, and I don't know if this is the person she has in mind, so my teenager, I think, is depressed. He is a Christian, but seems very, very detached and very withdrawn. Where do I start trying to help him?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously, I just need to be clear, I can't give advice in particular situations, but the advice we would always say is talk to someone about this. Perhaps you might want to talk to two people. You might want to talk to your church minister, sure, but you perhaps also want to talk to your GP. And what I would always say is, particularly if you're working with a teenager or another adult, please get their permission before you go and talk to someone else. I always refuse to talk to people if they say, can I ask you about such and such? My first response is always, do they know that you are talking to a psychiatrist? Because I'd rather get that clear first and foremost. I will not get involved in conversations where the person doesn't know that I'm being spoken to. But I think, if there's a treatable illness there, then there ought to be treatment. If there is, it could be something simple like some resources through the church, like a counselor through the youth ministry or something like that would be helpful. But involve people in that, and don't see it as just one problem. How can you be joyful when you are depressed? I mean, I guess, like I say, these two things are linked to a certain degree. If you are going through an episode of depression, people often say they struggle with their faith. The first thing I'd say is that you are not alone. There's a great book called Genius, Grief and Grace by a chap called Gaius Davis, who interestingly enough was Martin Lloyd-Jones's son-in-law, for what it's worth, but he was a psychiatrist in London, and he wrote this book called Genius, Grief and Grace, looking back at some of the great heroes of the faith over the years, going back to William Cowper, the great hymn writer who wrote When God Moves in Mysterious Ways. William Cowper wrote that hymn. He was staying with John Newton at the time, writing the only hymns together, Amazing Grace, etc. All comes out of this stable. And William Cowper was walking along the banks of the river, and he was so close to throwing himself into the river and killing himself. And what happened was the clouds seemed to part. I don't think a voice came down, but the clouds parted, and he realized actually that he had to go home. And he wrote, God moves in mysterious ways, his actions to perform. And one of the great lines in that is, God is his own interpreter. He will make it plain, Cowper says. And what he means by that is that we shouldn't try and second guess God. If God seems distant, we shouldn't sort of say, where are you? God has his own timings for working these things out. And Cowper is a great example of someone who was able to hold this tension of a lively, active, vibrant, evangelical Christian faith and severe, profound, medical, bedbound for weeks on end depression. He held those two together. And there's a great autobiography of his by, I'm going to forget who it is, a politician who was a Christian. It'll come to me, but there's a great autobiography of William Cowper and John Newton that really
Jonathan Aitken.
Jonathan Aitken, thank you. So Jonathan Aitken has written a book about this. I suppose I see them as emotion and heart, but soul belief, if that makes sense. So your sort of soul belief is your gut. You know, it's always difficult to translate these things in the Bible because the Greeks were unnecessarily dualistic and the Hebrews used the word heart and soul when they meant the brain, and it's always difficult to tie these things out. But it's a deep-seated, I choose to believe, I choose to be joyful, I count it all joy when I experience sorrows and sufferings of every kind, as St. Paul said. You know, it's a deeper gut choice, whereas depression is an emotion. Depression will come and go to a certain extent. Even in chronic depression, there are good days and bad days. There will be phases of depression and phases of better functioning, and I suppose it's trying to separate those things out. You know, one of the great pieces of wisdom from the Ignatian spirituality is, do not undo decisions in the darkness that you made in the light, if that makes sense. You know, because actually when you're in a boat and you're trying to sail in towards the shore and you know the storm is there, but the storm is blowing towards you, the cloud and the rain are coming towards you, you know, actually the shore is bearing 367 and you ought to carry on that bearing. And actually if you go, oh no, the wind's too strong this way, I've decided the shore is over there, that is the way to get lost at sea. We saw the shore from 15 miles out and we set sail for it. And now we are in a storm, and we shouldn't change those deep things, they landmarks, those deep sort of choices, as Ignatian spirituality would call them, that we made in the light, because the light, generally speaking, it is the light. You can see more in the light. So make those spiritual choices in the light and doggedly hold on to them in the dark.
Again, helpful stuff, Rob. I've got two final questions as we come to the end, both of which actually haven't come off Pigeonhole. They've I know Rob's following on Pigeonhole, so this comes as a nice surprise to you, because there are ways people can comment on Facebook or Twitter, wherever, and there's a couple of really good ones that have come in via social media I wanted to end with. The first person asks, they say, you know, we talked in the interview, Rob, about we live in this very performance-based society that can bring all kinds of stresses to people if you try and find your self-worth in, you know, your job and so on and so forth. But they rightly point out, they say sometimes evangelical churches can be very performance-orientated. You know, if you measure up, you're in. If you don't, you're out. And I think the way this person's asked this question, I suspect they may have a slightly bad experience of that. How can churches perhaps avoid doing that and damaging people's mental health by what we laden onto people? The gospel, you know, Jesus said, you know, come to me, my burden is light, all you who are heavy laden. Sometimes the church just puts burdens onto people. Any advice for church leaders on how we can avoid doing that?
I would agree. I think the leaders of big churches need to wake up and smell the coffee, is the short answer. I've often, pretty much always have lived and worked in the same town that I've attended churches, and I have heard at church on Sunday, aren't we doing amazing stuff? We've got such amazing testimonies, all these great things are happening. And I'm sitting there thinking, hang on, you haven't heard the backstory, have you? You haven't heard about the people who left this church. Because you're not in touch with them. They've left the church, so they're gone from your radar, but they're in my clinic. You know, so I think that the problem with the performance-based thing, it's bad for a whole bunch of different reasons that I think people can work out. But it's particularly bad if you are going through a stage in your life where you are not performing as you would normally. And I'm not talking about, you know, hyper performance. I'm talking about everyday levels of performance, and then you go through a spell where you are sick. And some churches will drop people. Some churches will say, well, look, you know, you can't come along, or you know, we're not going to give you this role because we don't think you can cope with this at the moment, and that is the way out. And actually that's just a phase in that person's life. We should go for the character rather than the capacity, if that makes sense, because that person may well have capacity in the future. There's a lovely book in the Bible, the book of Philemon, and St. Paul is in prison with this slave on Onesiphorus, and this guy went through a really, really tough time in life and ended up not performing at all, negatively performing. He'd been locked up, and Paul mentors him and encourages him in prison, and then he writes this lovely letter to Philemon, and he says, what once was not of use to you is now of use to you. I commend back to you your servant Onesimus. And he sends him off to him, and he says, right, this is someone who actually, St. Paul, I have seen through a period of low performance, and I'd encourage you to do the same. And if that person had been sort of kicked off, and I think I think, there are so many things. There's such a pressure, isn't there? And particularly big churches think, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, because no one else is doing it. And what are those little small churches doing? Well, the answer is the small churches are looking after people in a slightly more generous way often. I go to the church at the end of the road, and I'm so grateful for that acceptance and speed of change and pace of change. Liturgy can be a great defense for people as well when they're going through stressful times. I have been to evangelical churches for most of my life, but a 1622 old prayer book service and just slow down. And I think we need to be aware of the sort of busyness of some of these things. So that's probably me having a little bit of a rant as well. If you are an evangelical church leader, what I would say is please start talking about this, because actually we know that best part of, I think, 30% of evangelical church leaders have taken antidepressants at one point in your life. So you're kidding yourself if you're bulletproof. Talk to your friends. You'll probably find out they're taking antidepressants too. And then perhaps your two churches can work together and try and find a better way forward that is slightly more compassionate.
Oh, don't worry about the rant. I made it. That kept it interesting. Okay, one last question, again via social media. I really like this one, actually. It's a very different one. Someone who's has commented that they are a mental health nurse, and a lot of pressures around that, especially kind of right now, and just sort of just encourage, really more of a comment. I'm going to turn it into a question. How can churches best support folks like yourself and others who are involved in the mental health professions? Are there things that churches can be doing to support those working in the mental health services? Because there's pressure that comes with that for you and for others. Are there things we can be doing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there was the great sort of clap for the NHS, and everyone was talking about intensive care nurses and this sort of thing. And obviously, there's a particular way in which they were on the front line and now are again. But actually, the Scottish government, our mental health minister, we're one of the few countries in the world that's got a dedicated minister for mental health. There's a position paper from the Scottish government that explicitly says when we are thinking about making adjustments in the NHS to cope with another COVID surge, some specialities will be pulled back, but mental health should not be. So mental health is very much being put up there as a priority specialty within the NHS at the moment. And I think it'd be good for churches to talk about that, to realise that, and not just pray for intensive care nurses. Likewise, it would be great if churches perhaps had a regular focus where mental health could be on the agenda. We've got a thing called the Mental Health Access Pack on the website, which is a sort of bite-sized resource for ministers or interested people to help churches engage with this. Would you take advantage of Healthcare Sunday, which is in September, run by the Christian Medical Fellowship, or World Mental Health Day, which is on the 10th of October, and perhaps have a focus Sunday service around that, where the topic is a sermon around this. And we've got a resource on our website called Mental Health Sundays. We've even written the sermons for you, given you the PowerPoint, suggested the service structure. What I'd suggest is keep the music fairly normal. Don't go for lots of depressing music. Don't go for deliberately happy music. Just go for standard music. But have a testimony, have a sermon, have a focus on it, and then for the whole church. Mental illness work is not something that happens over there. I don't like it when churches appoint a counsellor to their staff just to deal with all the mess. And they say, right, okay, the counsellor works in that room over there, and that's where all the mental distress is taken care of, so we can get on with doing the rest of church life. So much of the Bible is about emotions, that we should be having this as a core topic. We don't like discussing it, do we? Likewise, we don't like discussing money in churches, yet Jesus spoke tons about money and stewardship and how we should use our money. So let's try and have a mental health focus in our church once a year and commit to doing that on a regular basis. Let's make it a mental health friendly church. So we've answered some of these questions beforehand. I could go on and on and on, but yeah, let's give it the priority, I think, in my humble opinion, I think it deserves.
Rob, we've come to the top of the hour. So grateful that you've been able to spend this hour with us. Thank you for all that you've shared. for folks who missed or forgotten Rob's kind of earlier kind of sort of references he mentioned, Rob has written 3 fantastic books with one of his colleagues at his organization. So do check out the Worry book and the Factions book, the Guilt book. Do also check out the Mind and Soul Foundation. We got their URL, and loads and loads of resources there that you can dig into much more deeply. And again, if you want to watch this webinar and again catch some of the stuff that we've said perhaps at high speed, or if your internet connection was a bit choppy, it'll be archived on the SOLAS webpage. We've got another webinar coming up in a couple of weeks' time, but one kind of final plug as we leave. We really want to make these webinars kind of scratch where people are itching. The mental health one we've done tonight came out of a suggestion that somebody emailed in, and we really want to be tackling the topics and finding the guests that would really serve our audience. So we've got another pigeonhole, the format, the technology we use for the Q&A tonight. We've set a special pigeonhole up where you can tell us what topics you'd love us to cover. If you go to pigeonhole.at and then put in SOLAS 2020 as the code, and if there's a topic, a question about the Christian faith, anything at all, let us know, and then we'll take some of that response and use it to shape future guests, future topics, so we can make these webinars of the most use to the most people. But thank you all for listening at home tonight, and Rob, once again, thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It certainly has. I've really enjoyed it.
And to all of you at home, have a wonderful rest of the day. Good night if you're in the UK, or if you're in some other time zone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time on a SOLAS webinar. Good night.